They never told you that the first lie was whispered inside a temple. I'm not talking about Eden, nor about the serpent. I'm talking about cold stone walls echoing with hymns, golden crosses polished under dim light, and voices trained to sound like the very echo of God himself. You walked in believing that truth lived there, and maybe you even felt something, a warmth in your chest, a strange peace in the air. But as the years went by, you began to notice something unsettling. Certain words didn't soothe you. They scorched you subtly and visibly. They were small phrases, harmless on the surface, repeated over and over until they fused with your thoughts, until you could no longer tell where your own beliefs ended and theirs began. These weren't simply sermons, they were scripts. And those scripts had one purpose: to keep you in alignment with a system that needs you to remain kneeling. They speak of humility, but in the hidden spaces between their words, they mean submission. They speak of prosperity, but under the varnish of hope they mean control. They speak of love, but they place locks on your soul, defining for you exactly who deserves that love, and under what conditions. There are prayers, long, poetic, and beautiful, that are crafted not to awaken you but to make you forget who you are. There are rituals that program your mind like a soft, unnoticeable hypnosis, making you accept less than what your spirit came here to find. There are interpretations of sacred texts that have been shaped, trimmed, and twisted across centuries so that they never point toward the path that could set you free, only toward the road that always leads back to the same altar, the same offering box, the same hands counting what they told you was God's share. And maybe you've felt it, that sharp edge beneath the velvet. Maybe you've sat in those pews, staring at the stained glass, wondering why certain questions are never answered, or worse, why asking them feels dangerous. Maybe you've noticed that certain parts of the scriptures are read aloud with fiery passion, while others are left in silence, as though they never existed. That is not an accident. That is not forgetfulness. That is design. A design that depends on you staying loyal to the voice at the pulpit, rather than the whisper in your own soul. You were never broken. You were trained to believe you were broken, so that someone else could sell you the cure. This is the hidden architecture of false teachings, a structure so old and so polished that it disappears into the background like wallpaper you stop noticing after a lifetime. But tonight you will notice. Tonight we will strip the paint from the walls and see the blueprints underneath. And once you see them, you can never unsee them. Before we go further, comment where you're watching this from and make sure to like and subscribe if something inside you already knows this truth. They told you that without them, you are lost. Without their guidance, their covering, their blessing, you are like a ship without a rudder, destined to sink into the black sea of sin. At first, those words feel protective, like a father shielding a child from a storm. But listen closer, feel the weight behind the softness, and you'll notice it is not protection they are offering, but dependency. This is the first great false teaching, one woven so deep into sermons, hymns, and prophetic words that most never see it for what it is. They do not tell you that your connection to the divine was written into your very being before you ever walked through their doors. They do not tell you that the spark in your chest, the one that pulses quietly when you pray alone, needs no human permission to burn. Instead, they wrap that spark in layers of doctrine, convincing you that the flame is not yours to tend, that it belongs to the institution. You see, this teaching works like an invisible leash. It doesn't pull hard. It doesn't need to. The leash is woven of fear and the illusion of safety. They will tell you stories of those who left the covering, people whose lives, they say, fell into ruin, whose families shattered, whose minds were consumed by confusion. These stories may be exaggerated or sometimes entirely fabricated, but their purpose is the same: to plant a seed in your mind that whispers, if you ever step away, you will be destroyed. That seed takes root quietly, and before long, the idea of walking your own path feels not like freedom but like suicide. And so the system thrives. You return week after week, not always because you are inspired, but because you are afraid of what might happen if you don't. You keep tithing, not because you believe every coin is holy, but because you've been told God's favor depends on it. You let them speak for God, because the thought of hearing him for yourself has been labeled dangerous, rebellious, even demonic. The great irony is that the very scriptures they preach from declare the opposite, that you are the temple, that the Spirit speaks to you directly, that nothing can separate you from the love that created you. But those verses are read quickly, without emphasis, as if they are small print in a contract no one expects you to read. I once heard a man in the back row whisper to another, "If they knew we didn't need them, they'd have nothing left." He was gone the next Sunday. No explanation, no farewell, just an empty seat, as if he had been erased. That's how it works. Anyone who discovers the truth becomes a danger to the system, and the system knows how to remove dangers quietly. This is why the first false teaching is so effective. It's not about convincing you they are right, but convincing you that without them you are nothing. And when you believe you are nothing, you will cling to anything that promises to make you whole, even if that very thing is what keeps you broken. It starts subtly. You raise your hand in a Bible study, not to challenge but to understand. The preacher smiles, but his eyes narrow just enough for you to notice. He answers your question with another question, a circular one, and the room laughs lightly but not warmly. From that moment, you learn. Curiosity is dangerous here. This is the second false teaching, one that binds the mind more effectively than chains. The idea that questioning spiritual authority is rebellion against God himself. It sounds holy, but it's nothing more than control, disguised as reverence. In a healthy search for truth, questions are doors. In this system, they are alarms. They've programmed the congregation to hear a question as an attack, not a request for understanding. So when you ask why certain verses are skipped, why history tells a different story than the sermon, or why the God they preach seems angrier than the one you feel in prayer, the air in the room changes. You are no longer a listener. You are a threat. And in the unspoken rules of this, house threats must be silenced. They might not call it punishment. Instead, they cloak it in spiritual language, guarding the flock, protecting unity, avoiding the spirit of confusion. But listen closely to the undertones. It's fear speaking. Fear that if too many questions are asked, the answers might unravel the script they've been rehearsing for generations. Because here's the truth they won't admit. The system survives, not because its teachings are flawless, but because it teaches you never to look too closely. The most dangerous questions are always the simplest. Why does a God of love require fear to be obeyed? Why do men in robes decide what God can and cannot say today? Why are the miracles of the past only read about, but never seen? These questions carry a frequency, a vibration that stirs the soul awake. That's why the system teaches that the very act of asking them is sinful. It's not your faith they're protecting, it's their authority. And so, a subtle conditioning begins. You stop raising your hand. You silence the thoughts before they reach your lips. Eventually, the questions don't just stop being spoken, they stop being formed. This is the goal. A congregation that no longer wonders, no longer doubts, no longer seeks, because a people who do not seek will never find, and a people who never find will keep buying the map. I once met a woman who told me, with tears in her eyes, I thought I was losing my faith because I had doubts. Now, my doubts were the first steps toward the truth. She had left her church 3 months earlier. She still prayed every day, but now, for the first time, she prayed without fear of her own thoughts. That is the liberation they fear most. Not losing members, not losing tithes, but losing control over your questions. Because once you realize that God is not threatened by your curiosity, you'll see that the ones who are were never speaking for him in the first place. They smile from the pulpit, holding the microphone like a scepter, the lights warm against their perfectly tailored suits. Their words drip with polished charm. God wants you to be blessed beyond measure, and tonight is your night of breakthrough. At first it feels inspiring. Who wouldn't want to believe that the creator of the universe is waiting to flood your bank account, heal your credit score, and hand you the keys to a bigger house? But hidden beneath the applause, beneath the rising music, is the third false teaching, that material wealth is proof of God's favor, and lack of it is proof of your failure. This teaching is seductive because it offers a tangible scoreboard for your faith. If you are healthy, wealthy, and admired, you must be doing something right with God. If you're struggling, if your bills are late, if your body is sick, the unspoken message is that you are somehow out of alignment. And so, the offering plates get heavier, the pledges bolder. You give and give and give again, told that each seed you sow will return to you pressed down, shaken together, and running over. But somehow, the only ones who seem to live in overflow are the ones standing on the stage. In private, they will tell you, you can't outgive God. But the truth is, you can certainly outgive your own survival. I've seen families skip meals to fulfill a faith pledge, convinced that God was watching and keeping score. I've seen elderly women empty the last of their pensions into envelopes, believing the next month would bring a miracle deposit. Sometimes they receive just enough to keep hope alive, but often nothing changes, except the church's bank account. What makes this teaching dangerous is how it warps identity. Instead of seeing yourself as inherently worthy of God's presence and love, you begin to see yourself as a project in progress, a spiritual investment portfolio. And when the returns don't come, you blame yourself. Not the system, not the manipulation, you. The shame becomes a self-feeding cycle. The poorer you are, the more desperate you become to prove your faith, and the more you give, hoping for the breakthrough that never comes. They will point to ancient kings and prophets, twisting their stories into proof that divine favor is always material. They will skip the parts where those same figures walked through deserts, wore rags, or gave away everything they owned. They will never preach the words of the teacher who said, "Life does not consist in the abundance of possessions," because those words would shatter their business model in a single sermon. I once heard a preacher confess to another, not knowing I was listening, "If they stop believing wealth equals favor, we'll lose half our offering." That wasn't a slip of the tongue, that was the blueprint speaking out loud. This is the cruel beauty of the lie. It keeps you giving not out of gratitude, but out of fear that your empty wallet means an empty relationship with God. And as long as you believe that, they don't need to chain you. You'll walk back into their hands willingly, thinking you're walking toward heaven. They say it softly, like a nurse delivering bad news with a forced smile. God is teaching you something through this pain. It's meant to comfort you, to wrap your suffering in holy cloth, to make you believe the bleeding is sacred. But this is the fourth false teaching, that every wound, every loss, every moment of anguish in your life has been meticulously scripted by God as part of some mysterious plan. And once you accept that idea, you stop fighting back. I've seen people endure years of abuse, telling themselves, "This is my cross to bear." I've seen mothers bury their children while whispering, "The Lord gives and the Lord takes away," their eyes hollow with a grief they've been taught to sanctify instead of question. This lie turns pain into a prison cell that looks like a chapel. It teaches you to worship at the altar of your own suffering, to call your chains lessons, and to believe that fighting them would be resisting God Himself. The truth they will never tell you is that not all suffering is holy. Some of it is engineered, sustained, and exploited by systems that profit from your endurance. A person convinced their suffering is divine will tolerate far more than someone who knows they were born to be free. And so, the system repeats the same phrases: be still, endure until the end. Your reward is in heaven. Words that sound like faith but function as sedatives. Of course, there is truth in the idea that challenges can shape us, but that's not the same as saying every blow to the soul comes from God's hand. There is a vast difference between learning from hardship and being told to romanticize it. Yet the latter is what keeps pews filled with silent, broken people who dare not ask for deliverance, because they've been told deliverance would be rebellion against the divine lesson plan. This teaching also serves as a shield for corrupt leadership. When abuse happens inside the church, it's easier to tell the victim, "God is refining you," than to confront the predator. When financial ruin follows a church's manipulation, they say, "God is teaching you dependence." The pain is rebranded as providence, and the real source of harm remains untouched. I once met a man who had been bedridden for a decade. His pastor visited twice a year, always with the same words: "You are a testimony of faithfulness." The man told me quietly, "If faithfulness means staying here, I'd rather be unfaithful." His eyes weren't angry. They were tired. Tired of being told his cage was a gift. Here is the dangerous beauty of this lie. If they can make you see every wound as God's will, you will never reach for the key that has been in your hand all along. You will sit in the dark, praying for the light, not realizing the door was never locked. They don't say it outright. They wrap it in polite theology, in carefully chosen scriptures, in titles and ceremonial garments. but the message seeps into the air you breathe. Your access to God runs through them. This is the fifth false teaching, the idea that you cannot fully know, hear, or be heard by the divine unless you pass through the filter of your pastor, priest, or spiritual leader. It's an invisible hierarchy. Where God sits above, you sit far below, and between you stands a man or woman with a key they claim you cannot hold. It begins subtly. You come with a question, and instead of being encouraged to seek God directly, you are told, "I will pray on your behalf." You come with a vision, and they ask, "Did you submit that to leadership for confirmation?" You confess a sin in your private prayer, but they say, "Come and confess before me so I can absolve you." Each step conditions you to believe that God doesn't trust you to handle the sacred without their supervision. And yet, if you open the very scriptures they preach from, you find the opposite: the veil torn, the Spirit poured out on all flesh, the voice of God speaking to shepherds in the fields, fishermen in their boats, prisoners in their cells. No pulpit required, no human approval stamp. But this truth is dangerous to the system, because if you believe you can hear from God directly, you no longer need their translation, and without the need for translation, their power fades. I once overheard a conversation in a small church kitchen. A young woman told her pastor, "I felt God tell me to start a Bible group at my home." His smile froze. "Let's not rush ahead of God's timing," he said. "You should let me guide you through this first." She nodded politely. The group never happened. Months later, she stopped coming to church. I wonder if she still prays in her kitchen, waiting for permission she never needed. This false teaching is not just about spiritual control. It is about identity theft. The moment you hand over your right to speak to God and hear from Him yourself, you give away the very core of your relationship with the divine. You reduce your spiritual life to second-hand messages, to watered-down interpretations, to crumbs falling from another's table. And if that other person ever becomes corrupt, and many do, you are left drinking from poisoned water, unable to tell the difference because you've forgotten the taste of the well. The most terrifying part is how this teaching is enforced without ever being formally stated. You feel it in the hesitation before praying aloud without someone's blessing. You feel it when you doubt your own visions because they don't align with the official line. And over time, you stop trying to hear God at all because you've been convinced you're deaf without them. But you were never deaf, you were never unworthy, you were never on the outside looking in. You have always been one breath away from the presence they try to sell you. And the day you realize that is the day their pulpit stops being a throne. They call it loyalty. They call it spiritual submission. They tell you that to question, to hesitate, to pause before obeying is the mark of a weak believer. And so, the sixth false teaching takes root, that blind obedience is not just good. It is the highest form of faith. They dress it in scriptures about Abraham, about the disciples dropping their nets, about soldiers in the army of the Lord, but the obedience they demand is not to God. It is to them. It starts small. They ask you to help with a ministry project and you say yes without thinking. They ask you to cancel personal plans for a church event and you do it without question. Soon the requests grow heavier, the costs greater. You find yourself giving time you don't have, money you can't spare, energy you can't replenish, and each time you obey without hesitation, they praise you as an example to others. The praise feels good, holy even, but the real test comes when the request no longer feels right, when something inside you tugs and says no. In a healthy faith, that tug is where discernment lives. In the system, that tug is labeled rebellion. They will quote verses about touching not God's anointed, and obedience being better than sacrifice. They will warn you that disobeying leadership is opening a door for the enemy. Fear becomes the fence that keeps you inside their control. And the longer you stay inside, the more you confuse obedience to them with obedience to God. I met a man once who had been told to leave his job because his pastor believed it was worldly. The man obeyed. Within months, his family was in debt, his marriage straining, his health failing from stress. When he approached the pastor about finding new work, he was told, "God is testing your faith. Stay the course." He stayed another year before the breaking point came. By then, the damage was deep. "I thought obedience was always right," he told me, "but I learned too late. Obedience to the wrong voice is just slavery." The most dangerous part of this teaching is how it redefines virtue. Instead of teaching you to think, to seek, to weigh, and to discern. It trains you to override your own inner compass in favor of an external one controlled by another human. And once that inner compass is silenced, you can be led anywhere, even off a cliff, and you will go willingly, convinced you are walking in the light. They will tell you the highest praise God can give is, "Well done, good and faithful servant." But what they don't tell you is that the word faithful does not mean unthinking. It means full of faith, a faith that listens, that seeks, that tests, and that refuses to follow any voice that does not lead to life. Blind obedience is not faith. It is surrendering the very mind and spirit God gave you to protect you, and the day you start seeing that difference is the day the chains begin to loosen. They say it with warmth, arms open, smiles wide. Welcome home. We're your family now. And for many, that feels like salvation in itself, especially if you come from loneliness, from broken homes, from friendships that betrayed you. At first, this teaching feels like healing, but it is a carefully designed snare. The seventh false teaching, that the church is not just a family, but the only family you should truly have. It begins with subtle separation. They encourage you to spend more time at church than anywhere else. Bible studies replace dinners with old friends. Conferences replace family reunions. When your loved ones question the changes, you are told, they just don't understand your new walk. The implication is clear. Those who don't share the faith are outsiders, and outsiders are dangerous to your soul. Before you realize it, your social world has been rebuilt entirely within the church walls. The danger isn't in finding community. True spiritual family can be beautiful. The danger is in believing that all connections outside of it are suspect or disposable. I've seen parents discouraged from visiting children who live in sin. I've seen young people break off lifelong friendships because their pastor warned them those friends were pulling them back into the world. I've even heard leaders suggest that God will bless you more if you cut off relationships that don't align with the church's vision, even if those relationships are loving and supportive in every other way. This is not about faith. It's about control. Because once your only trusted voices are inside the system can shape your reality without resistance. If you doubt a teaching, there's no one outside to offer a different perspective. If you're hurt by a leader, there's no outside witness to tell you it's not okay. The walls close in until family means obedience, and love means compliance. I met a woman who left her church after 15 years. She told me the hardest part wasn't losing the building or the sermons. It was losing every friend she thought she had. The moment I stopped attending, she said, it was like I'd died. Not one call, not one message, nothing. She paused, her eyes wet but steady. Family doesn't stop loving you because you leave the house. The lie here is not in calling the church a family. It's in pretending it is the only family, the only safe place, the only true love you'll ever find. That is spiritual isolation disguised as belonging. And an isolated soul is the easiest to lead anywhere. They will say it's about protecting your faith, but faith doesn't need a prison to survive. Faith can walk into the world, love the world, and still remain unshaken. Real family, whether inside or outside church walls, is not built on the condition that you never leave. It's built on the truth that love does not fear your freedom. They stand at the pulpit with urgency in their eyes, the kind that makes your heart race before you even know why. Time is short, they say. The end is near. Any day now the trumpet will sound. And so begins the eighth false teaching, the doctrine of perpetual end times urgency, not as a call to live wisely, but as a tool to keep you in a constant state of fear and dependence. It's not that the scriptures lack warnings about the end. It's that in the hands of the system, these warnings are stretched, twisted, and repackaged into a never-ending crisis. Every news headline becomes a prophecy fulfilled. Every natural disaster is a divine sign. Every election is the turning point of history. And because the final moment is always just around the corner, there's no time to question, no space to reflect, only an unending pressure to give more, attend more, obey more before it's too late. This constant alarm serves a purpose. Fear keeps people from walking away. Who would dare leave the ark when the flood could start any minute? Who would pause to examine the map when they're told the enemy is already at the gates? It's a psychological siege, one that doesn't require walls or weapons, just the steady drumbeat of impending doom. I've met people who have lived their entire adult lives in this suspended state, their dreams put on hold because Jesus could come back tomorrow. They skipped education, turned down career opportunities, never traveled, never built anything lasting, all because they were told the world was too close to ending. And when the decades passed and the world kept spinning, they were left with regret they were too afraid to name. The system thrives in this environment because urgency kills patience, and without patience, you will sign any spiritual contract handed to you if it promises safety. You won't ask if the vision is true. You'll just run when they tell you to run, give when they tell you to give, hide when they tell you to hide. In this way, the end is near becomes less of a prophetic insight and more of a leash. But here's the unspoken truth. If the end were truly a heartbeat away, fear would be the last thing the divine would want in your spirit. The call would be to love more fiercely, forgive more freely, and live more fully, not to shrink your life into a bunker of anxiety. I once heard an old man say, "They've been telling me it's the last hour for 60 years. If it's still the last hour, then I guess God's clock runs different." He wasn't mocking the faith. He was mourning the life he'd never lived because he thought he'd never have time. The danger of this false teaching is that it steals both your present and your future. It traps you in a perpetual countdown that never reaches zero, until one day you look back and realize the real end came not with a trumpet, but with the quiet wasting of your days. It sounds so noble, so unselfish, so unquestionably right. If you serve the church, you are serving God. It's repeated in sermons, written on volunteer banners, whispered like encouragement in moments of exhaustion. And while there is beauty in genuine service, the ninth false teaching twists this idea into something far more dangerous, a subtle reprogramming that makes the needs of the institution synonymous with the will of heaven. It starts with small acts. You help stack chairs after service, greet visitors at the door, bring snacks for the children's ministry. At first it feels good. It feels like love in action. But over time the requests grow. Your weekends vanish into rehearsals, fundraisers, building, maintenance, endless meetings. You're told that God sees every hour you give, but somehow the hours spent with your own family, resting your own body, or seeking God in silence are never given the same honor. The system doesn't thrive on your spiritual health. It thrives on your availability. And so the more exhausted you are, the more they call it sacrifice. If your marriage struggles because of your church schedule, you're told to trust God and keep serving. If your health begins to crack under the weight of constant activity, you're told, the enemy attacks those doing God's work. The burnout isn't seen as a warning, it's treated as a badge of faithfulness. I met a woman who served in her church kitchen for 20 years. She was there for every potluck, every banquet, every funeral, every wedding. When her husband fell ill, she took a short break to care for him. A leader visited her home and said, "We really need you back. The kitchen ministry just isn't the same without you." He never asked about her husband's health. In that moment, she realized something painful. She hadn't been valued as a daughter of God, but as a resource. This is the hidden truth. Serving God is not the same as serving the church, and serving the church is not the same as serving God. The overlap exists, yes, but they are not interchangeable. True service to God can look like resting, healing, tending to your family, feeding the poor quietly without a ministry name attached. It can look like saying no to a program so you can say yes to the voice of God calling you elsewhere. But the false teaching erases that distinction. It conditions you to measure your worth by your usefulness to the institution. And when usefulness becomes your currency, the moment you can't give, you start to believe you have no value at all. The divine doesn't see you as a cog in a ministry machine, but the system often does, because as long as you equate their needs with God's will, they never have to ask for permission to use you. And the moment you wake up to that difference, you start serving from freedom, not from chains. It's never stated outright. No one stands at the pulpit and says, "God's grace runs out." But listen closely, and you'll hear it woven into countless sermons, subtle as a shadow. Yes, God forgives, but only if you meet the conditions. Only if you repent hard enough, fast enough, soon enough. Only if you don't cross the invisible line. This is the 10th false teaching. The belief that grace is fragile, conditional, and easily revoked. And it might be the most destructive of them all, because this lie strikes at the heart of the gospel itself. It tells you that no matter how far God's love reaches, your mistakes might still outrun it. It plants the terror that one wrong step could exile you forever. And when you believe that, you live in constant self-surveillance, policing every thought, every word, every desire, not from love, but from fear of divine abandonment. It's a perfect control mechanism. If you think God's acceptance of you is as unstable as human approval, then you'll do anything to keep it. You'll obey without question, serve without rest, give without limit. You'll let leaders speak for God because what if your own hearing is faulty? You'll cling to the institution because what if stepping outside it means stepping outside grace? But here is the devastating irony. The very grace they warn you is so fragile is, by its nature, unbreakable. It doesn't weaken when you fall, it rushes toward you. It doesn't expire when you doubt, and it waits for you. Yet in this system, they turn grace into a product with a shelf life, one they can sell back to you through performance, penance, and perfect behavior. I met a young man who left his church after confessing to a struggle. He had gone forward trembling, thinking confession would lead to healing. Instead, the leaders told him he could not serve, could not pray in public, could not be trusted until he had proven himself. They gave no timeline for how long that proof would take, because the point wasn't restoration. It was control. I thought grace meant God met me where I was, he told me, but they made it feel like he was walking away. This lie leaves people stranded in spiritual deserts, believing they've been cut off from the very source of life. It convinces them that love is conditional, mercy is rationed, and God's patience is shorter than human patience. And yet, deep down, something in the soul remembers otherwise. Something remembers the prodigal's father running, not waiting. Something remembers the shepherd leaving the 99 without hesitation. Something remembers the cross, and the thief beside it who had no time to prove himself before being welcomed home. If you forget everything else, remember this. Any voice that makes you doubt the permanence of grace is not speaking for God. It is speaking for a system that needs your fear to survive. And once that fear dies, you will see that grace was never in their hands to give or take away. Is this story resonating with you? Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now let's continue. Now you've seen them. 10 lies dressed in scripture, polished in ritual, reinforced by years of repetition until they felt like truth itself. You've seen how they weave together. A net made not of rope, but of words, tightening slowly around the heart. Maybe you've felt the pull of one or two or all of them. Maybe you've heard their echoes in your own memories. Sermons that made you smaller, prayers that made you afraid, rules that made you believe freedom was dangerous. If you have, then you know the weight of the system. But you also know something else, the cracks in it. Because the same mind they trained to obey is the mind now questioning. The same heart they told to stay silent is the heart now speaking. The same spirit they tried to confine is the spirit now remembering it was never theirs to keep. And that remembering is dangerous to them, because once you see the bars, you can no longer mistake them for walls of protection. The truth is simple, and it's been whispering to you all along. You were never nothing without them. Your questions were never sin. Your worth was never measured in offerings, in hours served, in pain endured. You were not placed here to live in countdowns, to trade family for loyalty, to shrink your life into the shape they approve. You were not born into a contract with middlemen and conditions. You came here already connected to the source they try to monopolize. And if you're wondering what to do with that truth, here's where I'll tell you the thing they fear most. You don't need permission to walk out. You don't need a ceremony, a letter, or a blessing from the ones who benefited from your chains. You only need to remember that the door has been open the whole time. That's the part they could never. Control your choice to step through it. I've watched people leave, not in anger but in peace. Some walk into other communities that value freedom. Some walk into silence for a season, relearning the sound of God's voice without microphones or stages. Some simply walk back into their own lives, into families and friendships that never stopped loving them. And in each case, I've seen the same thing. Their eyes change. They no longer scan for approval. They no longer flinch at every inner nudge. They look finally like they belong to themselves again. The system will call it rebellion. Heaven will call it coming home. Have you ever done something kind that changed a life forever? Tell me in the comments. And if this story made you feel something, Share it with someone who needs to remember who they are.